she was alone. 8 months pregnant. Locked inside a palace storage room. 3 hallways away from the man who put her there. The date was the 15th of November, 2019. The city was Doha, Qatar. Outside there were fireworks, a string quartet, and the kind of champagne that costs more than most people earn in a year. Inside a royal compound broadcast live to 32 million viewers, there was a wedding. And in a supply closet the size of a bathroom, a 33-year-old nurse from Bulacan, Philippines was biting down on a folded sterile cloth so nobody would hear her scream. No doctor. No family. No exit. Just her hands. Her 10 years of clinical training. And a newborn baby who had apparently decided tonight was the perfect night to make his entrance into the world. What she did next, in that room, with nothing but bare hands and the kind of willpower most of us will never be tested for, would bring one of the most powerful families in the Persian Gulf to its knees. Now, here is the part nobody tells you about women like Marisol de los Reyes. She had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been waiting for the right moment. And for 8 months inside that gilded cage, she had been quietly, methodically, invisibly building her way out. Tonight, it was ready. Before we go any further, if stories like this one matter to you, if the truth behind closed palace doors matters to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Marisol builds inside that compound over the next several months is the part nobody was supposed to survive long enough to tell. This is a fictional story inspired by real and documented patterns of migrant worker abuse in Gulf countries. The migrant worker abuse Gulf crisis is not a headline. It is a daily reality for hundreds of thousands of people. And tonight, we are going to walk through every single detail of one woman's story. Stay with me. Because it only gets more jaw-dropping from here. The morning after Marisol de los Reyes arrived at the Al Zafar Royal Compound, a household manager named Gaida met her at the entrance of the staff wing. Warm smile. Pressed uniform. Clipboard held with both hands. First, she asked for Marisol's phone. Standard protocol for all live-in medical staff. Privacy protection for the royal family, she explained. Then she asked for her passport. Also standard. Also logged. A printed receipt was handed over with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The whole transaction took less than 90 seconds. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made a threat. There was no moment that, looking back, you would point to and say, there. That was the warning. And that is exactly the point. Because this is how it almost always works. Not with fear. Not with force. But with paperwork. A signature. A smile. And a receipt you are told you can redeem the moment your contract ends. Marisol was 33 years old when she accepted the position in Doha. She was a registered nurse with board certification and a decade of clinical experience, much of it in palliative care. She knew how to hold a dying patient's hand and a grieving family together in the same room at the same time. She was also the primary financial support for her mother, her younger sister Danica, and her teenage brother Noel, all 3 of them still in Baliwag, Bulacan, in the house she had been helping to keep standing since she was 22. Let me say this clearly, because it reframes everything that follows. Marisol was not naive. She was not impulsive. She was not chasing romance or luxury in a foreign country. She was a working professional making a calculated decision to take the highest paying position available to her, one that would allow her to clear her family's debt, fund her brother's university education, and build, for the first time in her adult life, something resembling financial security. The offer came through a licensed recruitment agency in Manila with verifiable accreditation. The salary was confirmed. The role was clear. Private palliative nurse to Shaika Wada, the 72-year-old matriarch of the Al Zafar household, who was in the advanced stages of congestive heart failure. Everything on paper was above board. What the paper did not say, what it never says, is that the moment Marisol stepped off that plane and handed over her documents, the entire legal architecture of her situation changed. Under Qatar's kafala system, a migrant worker's legal status is tied to their employer. Not to a recruitment agency. Not to the state. to the specific household or company that brought them in. If the job ends, the residency visa is cancelled. The worker gets a limited window to transfer to another employer or leave the country. Their right to remain is conditional and temporary. This system has been extensively documented and criticized by international human rights organizations including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, specifically in the context of domestic workers in the Gulf, a category that represents one of the largest and most vulnerable populations in the migrant worker abuse Gulf crisis. Marisol did not know the term kafala yet, but she would come to understand bone deep exactly what it meant. In those first weeks, though, none of that weight was visible. She settled into the rhythm of the compound. She administered Shaika Wada's medications on schedule. She sent money home every second Friday. She called her mother every Sunday afternoon on the compound's monitored staff phone, keeping her voice light. Describing the weather, the size of the rooms, the food. She was professional. She was focused. She was, by every outward measure, fine. She had no reason yet to be anything else. The man who would change that had not yet walked through the door. Pause here. Before we go further, I want you to think about something. If you were designing a trap for someone like Marisol, educated, alert, emotionally self-contained, trained to observe human behavior in high-pressure situations, how would you do it? Not with threats. Not with obvious manipulation. You would do it with patience, consistency, the appearance of genuine attention. You would make her feel, slowly and deliberately, like she was the one person in a very isolating place who truly saw her. Keep that in mind. Sheikh Tareem Al-Zufar was not what anyone expected. And that, it turns out, was entirely by design. He was 37 years old when Marisol first encountered him. The eldest son of the Al-Zufar family, heir to a real estate and energy portfolio worth an estimated $3.5 billion, and a graduate of University College London where he had studied international law. A man who understood, by profession and by inheritance, exactly how power operates. But inside the compound, he carried none of that weight visibly. He dressed casually around the medical wing. He made his own coffee in the staff kitchen rather than calling for it. He addressed household employees by name, not in the performative way of someone coached to seem relatable, but with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who had actually listened when people spoke. None of that seemed like anything other than decency. At the time, the first real conversation he had with Marisol happened on a Tuesday evening about 3 weeks after she arrived. Shaika Wada had experienced a difficult afternoon, labored breathing, elevated anxiety. Marisol had adjusted the medication protocol accordingly. Tareem came to check on his mother around 9:30 that night, long after most household staff had retired, and found Marisol still at the bedside, updating the care chart. He asked what she had changed, and why. She told him. Precisely. Clinically. Without softening the medical reality the way some people expect when they are talking to a family member. He listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions that made it clear he had genuinely understood. Then he said simply that he was glad his mother was in capable hands. And he left. Marisol went back to her chart. That was it. But he came back the following evening. And the one after that. Here is where I need you to pay attention. What developed between them over the following months was not dramatic in the way people imagine. There were no expensive gifts. No grand gestures. Nothing that would register to an outside observer as anything beyond a devoted son keeping watch during a difficult chapter of his mother's illness. What there was instead was consistency. He remembered that Marisol's youngest brother Noel was preparing for college entrance exams. She had mentioned it once, briefly, while explaining why she checked her phone during rest breaks. Weeks later, Tareem asked how Noel's results had gone. He had filed that detail away and retrieved it at the exact moment it would land with the most weight. He never touched her anywhere staff could observe. He never said anything inappropriate in a room with witnesses. But in the quiet hours of the medical wing, in the 40-minute stretches after Shaika Wada fell asleep and before the night guard completed his rounds, the distance between them closed. And Marisol was isolated. That is not a criticism. It is simply the reality of her circumstances. Thousands of miles from home. Inside a compound with restricted movement. Surrounded by people she managed professionally but could not call friends. When someone offers warmth in that kind of environment, the pull of it is not weakness. It is human. The relationship deepened over 5 months of stolen hours. Slowly, because Marisol was not a woman who lowered her guard quickly. She had spent a decade watching people at their most physically and emotionally fragile, which tends to erode whatever romanticism a person still carries into adulthood. She did not fall. She stepped forward carefully, with her eyes open. Which is precisely what makes what happened next so hard to sit with. Because in late August of 2019, 6 months after that first conversation over a medication chart, the engagement was announced. Sheikh Tareem Al-Zufar was to marry Shaikha Fawzah bint Jaber al-Mansouri, the only daughter of a rival energy family in a union that financial analysts described as one of the most significant private wealth consolidations in the Gulf region in a decade. The families had reportedly been in formal negotiations for more than a year. Which means those negotiations had been happening for the entire duration of what Tareem and Marisol had quietly built together in those late-night corridors. He did not tell her. He did not come to the medical wing that evening, or the next. He sent no message, no acknowledgement, no recognition that something between them had existed and was now over. He simply became unavailable. The warmth withdrew overnight. Completely. Cleanly. Replaced by a professional distance so total it was almost architectural. Everything stopped. And now, only now, is it worth naming what those 5 months actually were. The specific recall of her brother's name. The careful, deliberate invisibility of his attention in any shared space. The way he made confinement feel briefly like connection. These were not the instincts of a man who had stumbled into something he had not intended. These were the instruments of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. From the very first evening he walked into that medical wing with questions he already knew the answers to. It was early September 2019 when Marisol de los Reyes sat on the edge of a staff bathroom floor and stared at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test she had asked a grocery delivery worker to smuggle in, tucked inside a box of medical supplies. She did not cry. She did not panic. She sat there for a long time. Very still. In thought. That stillness, that deliberate, almost clinical composure in the face of what most people would describe as a catastrophic moment, tells you everything you need to know about who Marisol de los Reyes actually was. Because what she did in the minutes after confirming that pregnancy was not what fear does to a person. It was what training does. She began, quietly and methodically, to assess her situation the way she would assess a critical patient. Identifying the variables. Mapping the risks. Working through every available option in sequence. And one by one, every option closed. Let's go through them together, because I think this is where viewers of stories about migrant worker abuse in Gulf countries need to pay the closest attention. Option 1. Go to a hospital. Get proper prenatal care. Let the medical system do what it exists to do. Marisol understood with absolute clarity why that door was not open to her. While Qatar had been updating its labor laws under significant international pressure, particularly in preparation for the 2022 World Cup, the practical medical reality for unmarried women in 2019 was far more complicated than any press release acknowledged. Opening a maternity file required documentation. Without it, the risk of institutional reporting back to the household was real. For a migrant worker without her passport, without legal standing to remain independently, that single phone call could unravel everything. Option 2. Tell Tareem. She considered it for exactly as long as it took to think it through completely. And then she set it aside. Because the man who had ended a 5-month relationship by simply disappearing, no conversation, no acknowledgement, nothing, was not a man who would respond to this news by protecting her. He would respond by containing her. The baby, to him, would not be a child. It would be a liability. One capable of destroying his engagement to Shaikha Fawzah, fracturing a multi-billion-dollar family alliance, and exposing him to the kind of scandal that does not simply damage a dynasty. It restructures it entirely. Tareem had spent his entire adult life managing risk. Marisol understood that she was now one of those risks. Option 3, the Philippine Embassy. This one was not entirely closed. But it was extraordinarily dangerous to pursue too early. Without her passport, which remained locked in the household safe, her ability to establish documented identity was severely limited. And without leverage, without evidence, without a position of safety, approaching the embassy prematurely would alert the household before she had any protection in place. In documented cases involving migrant workers in the Gulf region, employees who attempted to seek embassy assistance without proper preparation were sometimes intercepted before they could reach consular staff. Employers were notified. Contracts terminated. Deportation process before any formal protection could be arranged. Timing, she understood, was everything. Every institutional door was locked from the outside. And the only person with a key was the same man whose name she could not safely speak inside that compound. So Marisol did what she had always done when a patient's condition exceeded the available resources. She worked with what she had. And here is where this story stops being a tragedy and starts being something else entirely. What Marisol de los Reyes built inside that compound over the next 3 months, from the inside, without help, without resources, without anyone who knew what she was doing, is honestly one of the most methodical, quietly brilliant acts of self-preservation I have ever had the privilege of researching. Stick around. Because we are just getting started. By October 2019, Marisol de los Reyes had accepted one fundamental truth about her situation. Nobody was coming to help her. Not because nobody cared. Because nobody knew. And by the time anyone found out through conventional channels, it would likely be too late to matter. She had watched enough critical patients deteriorate in under-resourced systems to understand that waiting for institutional intervention when you are already inside the institution causing the harm is not a strategy. It is a gamble. So she stopped waiting. And she started building. It began with the compound itself. Marisol, as the sole medical professional managing Sheikh Awada's care, had near unsupervised access to the palace's internal medical record system. She began adjusting her own entries, logging routine vitals, removing any notations that could flag a developing pattern, maintaining a paper trail that reflected a healthy, unremarkable employee. She addressed the physical reality of concealment next. At 8 weeks, her body had not yet changed visibly. But she was thinking months ahead. She submitted a uniform requisition for larger scrubs, documenting the request under a movement comfort justification tied to the physical demands of repositioning a bedridden patient during extended care shifts. It was the kind of administrative notation that no one reads twice. And inside the medical wing, where her institutional authority was absolute, and the security guards were trained exclusively to monitor the compound's perimeter, she moved with a freedom that did not exist anywhere else on the property. She began setting aside cash. Small amounts drawn from her monthly allowance over several weeks, kept in a sealed sterile supply envelope behind a false bottom in her medical kit. Nothing that would register as a pattern. Everything that would eventually matter. And then one evening in late September, she sat down next to a woman named Perla Mabedid in the staff kitchen. Perla was 41 years old. Also Filipina. She had been working as a housekeeper inside the Al-Zufar compound for nearly 5 years. Marisol had observed her carefully over several weeks. Her schedule, her access points, her relationship with household management. She had also noticed something else. Small discrepancies in the household petty cash logs. Nothing dramatic. The kind of thing a desperate person does quietly over a long time when they have run out of other options. Marisol sat down across from her. Waited until the kitchen was empty. And spoke in a low, even voice. She did not judge Perla. She did not threaten her. She simply told her the truth, that she was in trouble, that she needed a partner she could trust, and that if Perla was willing, what came next would be better for both of them. Perla looked at her for a long moment. Then she said yes. Over the following weeks, Perla's role as a housekeeper gave her access to virtually every corridor, utility room, and service entrance on the property. Access that security staff barely registered because domestic workers moving through a household are functionally invisible to people trained to watch for external threats. During her regular cleaning rotations, Perla mentally cataloged the compound's camera positions, guard rotation schedules, and the specific blind spots that existed along the northern perimeter, the side that faced a secondary service road rather than the main gate. She reported everything back to Marisol in fragments during brief overlapping breaks. Never too much at once. Never anything that would register as a pattern. It was during one of these conversations that Perla mentioned a driver named Buter Fahim. Buter had worked as a household driver for the Al-Zafar family for 7 years. He was reliable, discreet, and beneath the surface of his professional composure, quietly furious. 8 months earlier, the head of compound security had docked 3 weeks of his wages over an alleged vehicle maintenance oversight that Buter maintained to anyone who would listen was not his fault and had never been properly investigated. The formal grievance he submitted through the household's internal HR process had gone unanswered for months. He had not resigned because he could not afford to. Marisol did not approach him immediately. She observed him first. His schedule. His temperament. The specific quality of his frustration. She needed to understand whether his resentment was the kind that made a person reckless, or the kind that made a person careful. After 3 weeks of quiet observation, she concluded it was the latter. She approached him in late October during a window when the security rotation left the northern staff parking area unwatched for approximately 11 minutes. She told him only what he needed to know, that she needed a driver, on a specific night she would confirm later, to take her to the Philippine embassy without notifying household management. She would pay him from the cash she had been setting aside. He asked her one question. Whether she was coming back. She told him no. He told her he would be ready. The centerpiece of everything Marisol was building was not Perla's maps or Buter's cooperation. It was a letter. Over the course of 2 weeks in November 2019, working in 30-minute increments during the late-night hours when Shaika Wada slept and the wing was quiet, Marisol composed a detailed, evidence-backed account addressed to a labor welfare officer at the Philippine Overseas Labor Office in Doha, a government body established specifically to assist Filipino workers in the Gulf region experiencing employment violations or welfare emergencies. The Polo office operated under the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration and had formal protocols for receiving and acting on worker complaints, including cases involving passport confiscation, which is, by the way, a violation of both Qatari labor law and international labor standards set by the International Labor Organization. The letter documented everything. The timeline of her employment. The relationship with Tareem, with specific dates. The pregnancy. The passport confiscation upon arrival. The household's refusal to return it on request. Her fear of what would happen to her, and the baby once Tareem's wedding concluded and she was no longer useful to keep quiet. She included names, behavioral details, and dates precise enough that the account could not be dismissed as the unsubstantiated claim of a distressed employee. It read the way a clinical intake report reads. Measured. Specific. Almost unnervingly calm. She printed 2 copies on the medical wing administrative printer during a window when the system logs would attribute the print job to a routine care document. She sealed both in plain envelopes and gave them to Perla with instructions that were simple and non-negotiable. If Marisol went silent for more than 48 hours without making contact, send it. If Perla heard the medical wing fire alarm activate at any point, send it immediately, without waiting for confirmation. Not to one recipient. To 2 simultaneously. The Polo Labor Welfare Office. And the labor affairs correspondent at a Philippine press outlet that Perla had quietly identified through a network of overseas worker community groups she had been part of for years. Now, I need you to understand what this letter actually was. It was not a panic button. It was not luck. It was not a convenient escape hatch that materialized when the story needed one. It was a detonator. Built by hand. Over 3 months. From the only materials available inside a royal compound. On the last night of November 2019, Marisol sat alone in the medical wing long after the household had gone to sleep. She ran through every variable one final time. Perla. Buter. The letter. The cash. The blind spots on the northern perimeter. The combination to the passport safe. She had spent 6 weeks learning through patient daily observation of the household manager's morning routine. She was as prepared as the circumstances would allow. She knew, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had carried her through everything, that it might still not be enough. But it was everything she had. And she had built every piece of it herself. In late January 2020, 6 weeks before the wedding, a convoy of 3 armored black SUVs pulled through the Al Zafar compound's main gate. And Sheikha Fawzah bint Jaber al-Mansouri arrived. She was 29 years old. The only daughter of a man who had built one of Qatar's largest privately held infrastructure companies from essentially nothing. She held a master's degree in finance from INSEAD. She had sat in on her father's board meetings since she was 15. She understood, with the fluency of someone who had grown up inside it, that a marriage between 2 dynasties of this scale was not a romantic arrangement. It was a corporate merger with a ceremony attached. She had not come to the Al Zafar compound to prepare for a wedding. She had come to complete her due diligence. Because here is what Tareem did not know. 6 months earlier, in August 2019, her family's private financial intelligence advisors had flagged 2 outgoing transfers from Tareem's personal accounts. The amounts were substantial but not extraordinary for a man of his wealth. What made them notable was the destination, a holding company registered in the British Virgin Islands with no verifiable business activity, no public directors, and no traceable operational history beyond its date of incorporation. 2 transfers, 15 months apart, totaling just over $2.5 million, moving into a structure specifically designed to be difficult to follow. Her father's team had been quietly pulling the thread ever since. Fawzah arrived at the compound with those files already memorized. She was not suspicious in the way that makes a person emotional and reactive. She was suspicious in the way that makes a person methodical and patient. There is a significant difference between those 2 things. And that distinction would prove enormously important before the month was out. What nobody anticipated was how quickly she would notice Marisol. It happened within the first week. Not because Marisol had been careless, she had been extraordinarily careful. But Fawzah was the kind of observer who noticed things most people train themselves to overlook. Because overlooking inconvenient details is a survival skill in the world she had grown up in, and she had specifically unlearned it. She noticed the uniform sizing. Marisol had been requisitioning progressively larger scrub sets since October. The administrative justification was documented and plausible. But the physical reality of the woman wearing them told a slightly different story to anyone paying close enough attention. She noticed the fatigue. Not the ordinary tiredness of a demanding caregiving role. The specific layered exhaustion of a person carrying something beyond their documented workload. And she noticed the hand. Once. Just once. In a corridor outside Sheikha Wada's room, when Marisol believed she was alone between tasks. A brief, involuntary gesture, the right hand moving to her lower abdomen, resting there for 2 or 3 seconds before she caught herself and continued walking. Fawzah watched it from 12 feet away. She said nothing. She did not confront Marisol. She did not raise it with Tareem. She did not even write it down, because she had no need to. It was already filed in the part of her mind she reserved for information that was not yet actionable but might become so. What she did instead, within 72 hours of that observation, was contact her own private security team, 4 personnel who answered exclusively to her family's payroll, who had traveled with her to the compound as part of her personal protection detail, and instruct them to install a discreet surveillance feed covering the medical wing corridor and the supply room adjacent to it. The installation was logged in the household's internal security system as a routine upgrade to the matriarch's care monitoring protocols. It was processed and approved by household administration without a second glance. Tareem was never informed. She was not yet certain what she was watching for. But a woman who had spent years learning to read the hidden architecture of institutional arrangements understood one thing with absolute certainty: patterns that seem unrelated almost never are. The offshore transfers. The nurse with the changing uniform sizes and tired eyes. The involuntary hand at the abdomen. Individually, each of those details could mean nothing. Together, they formed the outline of something she needed to understand completely. Before she signed her name to a marriage contract. Not after. And so every night, while the compound hummed with pre-wedding preparations and the staff moved through their routines below, Fozia sat at the desk in her private suite with Tareem's financial files spread in front of her and a surveillance feed open on a secondary screen beside them. She was not afraid of what she might find. She had long since accepted that powerful men rarely become powerful without accumulating things they would prefer to keep hidden. She simply needed to know the full extent of it. Before November 15, 2020. The Al Zufar compound woke up differently that morning. By 7 o'clock, catering teams were moving through service entrances in coordinated rotations. Florists had been working through the night. A private events production company had transformed the compound's main reception hall into something that looked less like a private residence and more like a venue you find photographed in international lifestyle magazines. Cascading white florals. Imported Moroccan tile settings. Lighting rigs that had taken 4 days to install. 2 television crews had been granted limited access credentials to document the celebration for regional broadcast. 49 security personnel were deployed across the property that day. The majority, 32 of them, were assigned to the wedding venue itself. The main hall, the guest arrival corridors, the perimeter facing the primary road. The remaining 17 covered the compound's outer gates and staff entry points. The medical wing had 2. Marisol noticed that immediately. She had been tracking the security rotation for weeks. Mapping the staffing patterns. Understanding exactly how the household's protective infrastructure redistributed itself during high-profile events. And what she understood with the clarity of someone who had been studying this specific building for over a year was that a wedding of this scale was not a security event. It was a production. And productions consume resources in one direction, which means they create vacuums in others. This was her window. She had confirmed it with Buter 4 days earlier. She told him the date. The time, 11:30 in the evening, when the reception would be at its peak and the staff rotation at its most stretched. She told him to have the vehicle positioned on the secondary service road with the engine off and the lights down. He nodded once. And walked away. By 10 o'clock that night, the ceremony had concluded and the reception was in full momentum. Music carried through the compound's walls. Hundreds of guests. Marisol completed Shaika Wada's final medication round at 9:15, documented it, and returned to her room to change. She was 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant. She had spent the preceding months managing that reality with a discipline that is genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who has not worked in high-pressure clinical environments, where the protocol is to keep functioning regardless of what your body is telling you, because the alternative is that someone else suffers for it. Her hands, as she gathered the small bag she had prepared, were completely steady. They had always been steady. At 10:55, she moved out of the staff residential wing and into the northern service corridor. The route to the northern exit ran past the medical supply room, past the linen storage bay, and through a maintenance corridor that connected to the outer wall's secondary gate. The gate that faced the service road where Buter would be waiting. She made it as far as the junction between the service corridor and the maintenance passage. That was where it started. Not dramatically. Not with any of the sudden urgency that the word, labor, tends to conjure. It began the way it often does, a deep tightening pressure across her lower abdomen that was categorically different from anything she had felt before. And that her clinical training identified, with cold immediate certainty, for exactly what it was. She stopped walking. She stood in that corridor for approximately 30 seconds, breathing slowly, running a rapid internal assessment with the same methodical detachment she brought to every clinical evaluation. Her body had made a different decision. Buter was 200 meters away and unreachable without crossing a section of the compound that was now actively staffed. The northern exit was 40 meters further than that. The main gate was entirely out of the question. What was 11 meters behind her was the medical supply room. A windowless, lockable space she had worked in and around for over a year, stocked with everything she knew how to use. She turned around. She moved back down the corridor, pushed through the supply room door, and pulled a heavy equipment shelf across the entrance behind her. The plan she had spent 3 months building was gone. What remained underneath it? The letter with Perla, the alarm trigger, the preparation she had layered beneath the primary escape route precisely because she had known, with a nurse's unsentimental realism, that plans rarely survive contact with the moment they were built for, that was still intact. And it was the only thing that mattered now. Somewhere between 11:15 and 11:30 that night, the music from the reception carried faintly through the compound's walls. Distant. Almost surreal against the silence of the medical wing's northern corridor. Inside the supply room, Marisol de los Reyes was delivering her son alone. There is no clean or comfortable way to describe what that experience actually involves for someone without pain management, without medical assistance, without another human being in the room. Marisol knew, professionally and precisely, every stage of what her body was moving through. That clinical knowledge did not make it easier. What it did was give her a framework to hold onto when the pain reached the kind of intensity that strips a person down to something very basic and very raw. She knew what was happening. She knew what came next. And she kept moving through it, one stage at a time, the way she had always moved through the hardest moments of her professional life, by narrowing her entire focus to the immediate next thing that needed to be done. She used sterile gloves from the supply shelf. She managed the delivery the way a trained obstetric nurse manages an emergency birth, with the specific, practiced competence of someone who had assisted in enough delivery room crises to understand what the body does and does not need from you in those moments. Her son arrived at 11:43. He was small. Earlier than he should have been. And for a stretch of time that Marisol would later describe in the quiet of her own memory as the longest of her life, he did not make a sound. She cleared his airway. She held him. She waited. And then he cried. A thin, fierce, furious sound that bounced off the marble walls of that supply room and filled every single inch of the space. She wrapped him in sterile surgical draping from the second shelf, the only soft, clean material immediately available, and held him against her chest. Her hands throughout all of it had not shaken once. They did not shake now. What she did not know, in those first minutes after her son's arrival, was that Fozah's surveillance feed had been active the entire time. The camera installed 6 weeks earlier, positioned to cover the medical wing corridor and the supply room entrance, had flagged the barricaded door at 11:07. The feed had been running unattended on the secondary monitor in Fozah's private suite, while Fozah herself was present at the reception. A notification had been pushed to her personal security team. It was that alert that reached the compound's head of household security first. A man named Walid Saker, who had worked for the Al-Zafar family for 12 years. He reached the supply room door at 11:50, announced himself, received no response, and used his master access card to disengage the electronic lock. He stepped inside. And in the 3 seconds that followed, looking at Marisol on the floor, at the child in her arms, at the features of a newborn face that bore a resemblance no one in that household could have claimed was coincidental, Walid Saker understood with the full weight of 12 years of institutional loyalty that there was no version of this night where he walked away from that room without consequence attached to his name. He locked the supply room door. He called Tareem off the reception floor. It took 9 minutes for Tareem to arrive. He came in his formal wedding thawb, the gold-trimmed bish draped across his shoulders. He stepped into the supply room, looked at Marisol, looked at the child, and then did something that, of everything that happened that night, was perhaps the most revealing. He crouched down. He brought himself to her level. And he spoke quietly, in the same unhurried, warm register she had last heard from him 9 months earlier in a different corridor of the same compound. He told her he understood how frightening this was. That she had been incredibly strong. That he was going to make sure she was taken care of financially, permanently, in a way that would change her family's life and her son's future. He used the word comfortable. He used the word safe. He made it sound, for approximately 30 seconds, almost reasonable. Almost kind. Marisol listened to all of it without expression. And then, when he finished, she asked him one question. Quietly. Without anger. Without tears. Without any of the emotional register he might have been prepared to manage. Can I take my son home to Bulacan? The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man deciding there was nothing further worth performing. He stood. He straightened the bisht across his shoulders with the unhurried composure of someone returning to an event rather than leaving one. He looked at Walid. And said simply, "Handle it?" No trace. Then he walked back toward the reception. Marisol waited until his footsteps faded. Then she reached up, took the portable oxygen canister from the lower supply shelf, and swung it directly into the medical wing's wall-mounted fire alarm. The sound that followed was immediate and total. A building-wide alert that flooded every corridor, every stairwell, every room in the Al-Zafar compound simultaneously. Perla heard it. She did not hesitate. She did not wait for confirmation. She pulled the burner phone from the pocket of her uniform, opened the 2 drafted messages she had kept ready for weeks, and sent both simultaneously. The first, to the duty officer at the Philippine Overseas Labor Office in Doha. The second, to the labor affairs correspondent at a Philippine press outlet with documented regional coverage of migrant worker welfare cases in the Gulf. The letter was gone. The detonator Marisol Delos Reyes had built by hand over 3 months, from inside a royal compound, was live. The alarm was going. The letter was already sent. And 1 floor above, Fawzah al-Mansouri was watching all of it on a private screen. She had about 60 seconds to decide what kind of woman she was going to be. Fawzah had left the reception at 11:40 on the pretense of a private phone call. She had been watching the surveillance feed on her personal tablet from a private anteroom she had identified in her first week at the compound as the one space close enough to the main hall to justify a brief absence, and far enough from it to allow complete privacy. She had watched all of it. The barricaded door. The breach. Walid's face in the 3 seconds after he stepped inside and understood what he was looking at. Tareem arriving in his wedding clothes, crouching down, performing the same quiet warmth she had watched him deploy in a dozen professional contexts over the preceding months. The carefully modulated voice. The architecture of managing a situation rather than feeling it. She had watched Marisol ask her question. She had watched Tareem stand up, straighten his bisht, and give the order. And she had been completely still through all of it. Not from shock. Not from indecision. But from the specific quality of focus that takes over when a person who has been preparing for a version of a moment finally sees it arrive in its actual form. Because here is what Tareem did not know was happening simultaneously, on another screen, in the same building, while he was walking back toward his own wedding reception. At 11:53, a notification reached Fawzah's financial intelligence advisor. The confirmation she had been waiting weeks for had just cleared. One of the 2 flagged transfers from Tareem's personal accounts, the one routed through the British Virgin Islands holding company, had been traced through a secondary shell structure to a legal defense retainer account. The account had been used to fund the legal representation of a procurement intermediary charged with facilitating the movement of undocumented workers across Gulf borders in 2018. The case had been quietly settled. The charges had been reduced. The intermediary had walked. Tareem had not been named. He had been, in the language of financial investigators, adjacent to it. Close enough to have funded its resolution. Far enough to have maintained deniability. This was not carelessness. Careless men do not construct 2-layer shell company structures in offshore jurisdictions. This was a pattern. Documented. And now traceable. Belonging to a man who had just ordered the quiet disappearance of a postpartum woman and her newborn infant on his wedding night. Fawzah read the notification. She set the tablet face down on the side table. Then she made 3 decisions in under 60 seconds. The first decision was that her marriage to Tareem would proceed publicly. Canceling the wedding at this hour, with the compound full of international guests, journalists, and diplomatic personnel, would generate a story she could not control. And a story she could not control was a liability. What she needed was a story she could shape. And that required the wedding to have already happened. The second decision was that Marisol Delos Reyes and her son would not spend another hour inside that compound under Tareem's authority. The third decision was how to execute the second without triggering the first. She opened the encrypted communication channel to her personal security detail, 4 personnel who answered exclusively to her family's payroll, whose professional loyalty had never intersected with the Al-Zafar household at any administrative level. She gave them Marisol's location and 2 instructions: reach her before Tareem's security team regroups, and bring her to the main corridor. She did not tell them to be discreet. That was deliberate. Fozah's team reached the medical wing supply room at 11:58. The fire alarm was still running. A sustained building-wide alert that had by this point pulled the reception's diplomatic security personnel into the compound's interior corridors, sent the television crew's sound engineer into the hallway with his equipment rolling out of professional instinct, and prompted 3 foreign ambassadors present as wedding guests to step away from the reception hall in compliance with standard evacuation protocols. Their own security details had activated. The compound was full of witnesses. And none of them were there because Fozah had arranged it. They were there because Marisol had activated a fire alarm, and international diplomatic security protocols do not pause for royal weddings. Fozah's team reached the supply room. Marisol, holding her son against her chest in the darkness, listening to the alarm and to approaching footsteps she could not yet identify, made the decision to open the barricade. She had no way of knowing whose team was on the other side. But she had built a detonator, and she had activated it. And she understood that staying inside that room was the one option that guaranteed nothing good. She moved the shelf. She opened the door. Fozah's team guided her, moving quickly, not speaking beyond what was necessary, through the northern service corridor and directly into the main hallway of the Al-Zafar compound, where the lights were full, where cameras were rolling, where 2 ambassadors, a diplomatic security officer, and a journalist whose press credentials gave him access to the building's interior common areas were standing in the corridor. Fully present. Impossible to quietly remove. Marisol Delos Reyes walked into that hallway at midnight. Still in blood-stained scrubs. Holding her newborn son wrapped in sterile surgical draping. And she did not stop walking. Tareem appeared at the far end of the corridor 40 seconds later. He saw her. He saw the journalist. He saw the cameras. He saw the ambassadors. He did nothing. There was nothing left to do. The royal family's legal team convened an emergency internal meeting at 1:15 in the morning. The parameters of their situation had transformed completely in under 2 hours. Documented evidence had already been transmitted and received at the Philippine Overseas Labor Office. The labor press contact had acknowledged receipt. International witnesses had filed incident reports with their own diplomatic channels. And a credentialed journalist had footage he was under no legal obligation to suppress. Any action taken against Marisol Delos Reyes from that point forward would not resolve a scandal. It would create one. An international human rights exposure with a documented paper trail, credible witnesses, and a living woman holding a newborn infant as its central image. The legal team's recommendation was unanimous: stand down entirely. At 4:51 in the morning on November 16, 2020, Marisol Delos Reyes and her son were transferred to the formal protection of the Philippine Embassy in Doha. Escorted by Fozah's personal security team. Met at the embassy gate by a consular duty officer who had been alerted by the Polo Labor Welfare Office 3 hours earlier. She walked through that gate with her son in her arms and her passport, retrieved from the household safe by Fozah's team during the chaos of the alarm, in her hand. And for the first time in 14 months, she was standing somewhere that Tareem Al-Zafar had no legal authority to reach her. On November 18, 2020, 69 hours after Marisol walked through the gates of the Philippine Embassy in Doha, she boarded a flight to Manila with her son. He had no name yet. She had decided she would not name him in that city. Some things, she had quietly determined, belonged only to home. The morning after the wedding, Fawzah came to breakfast before Tareem. Her legal team was already seated. 3 attorneys representing the Al-Mansuri family office, answering to Fawzah's father, with no professional obligation whatsoever to the man now sitting across the table from them. She did not greet him with warmth or coldness. She poured her coffee, set the pot down, and slid a document across the table toward him. A post-nuptial financial agreement, drafted overnight. Precise in its language and unambiguous in its terms. Under Qatari law, post-nuptial agreements modifying asset arrangements between married parties are legally recognized when properly witnessed and executed. The document transferred significant independent financial authority to Fawzah's name, management rights over a defined portion of the merged family assets structured in a way that could not be reversed unilaterally. Tareem looked at the document. He looked at her. And what passed between them in that silence was not a conversation. It was a reckoning. The full and mutual acknowledgement, without a single word spoken, that the terms of their arrangement had been permanently redrawn by the events of the preceding 12 hours, and that both of them understood exactly why. He picked up the pen. He signed it. 3 months later, a woman named Perla Mabadid landed at Toronto Pearson International Airport with her teenage daughter Jasmine on a temporary work visa arranged through a Philippine migrant worker advocacy organization. She found work within 6 weeks, a housekeeping supervisory role at a hotel in Mississauga, salaried, documented, with full legal standing, and a passport that stayed in her own possession. In February, she sent Marisol a photograph from her new kitchen. Jasmine was on her lap. A cup of tea sat on the table between them, and Perla was looking directly at the camera with the specific settled expression of someone who has stopped bracing for the next thing to go wrong. 2 women had entered the Al-Zafar compound as migrant workers under a sponsorship system designed to keep them invisible and compliant. 2 women had found each other inside it. And 2 women had made it out on the other side. Not because the system had protected them. Because they had protected each other. In a small apartment in Baliwag, Bulacan, Marisol de los Reyes sat by an open window in the late afternoon heat, nursing her son. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted through the thin curtains, the particular way that makes a familiar place feel, after a long absence, like something closer to mercy than just a location. Her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. She looked at the screen. Perla's photograph filled it. Jasmine. The tea. The Canadian winter light. Marisol looked at it for a long time. Then she turned the phone face down, held her son a little closer, and did not look over her shoulder. She was done looking back. She never gave an interview. She never sold her story. She went home and she stayed there. The only record of what happened inside that compound is a letter sitting in a filing cabinet at the Philippine Overseas Labor Office in Doha, signed, dated, and still sealed. Just in case. And that, right there, is why this matters. This is not just a fictional story. The migrant worker abuse Gulf crisis is a documented, ongoing reality that affects hundreds of thousands of real people every year. If this story moved you, and I believe it did, please share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Because awareness is the first step. And the first step matters. Now, before you go, if you have watched this far, I know you are the kind of person who values truth, justice, and a really well-built plan. So here is my final request: subscribe. Hit the bell. Leave a comment with what you think Marisol should have named her son. And may God bless you with the wisdom to know your worth, the courage to protect it, and the right people standing beside you when the fire alarm goes off. Go well. And we will see you in the next story.